Okay, here we go again into the wild world of textual criticism. Woohoo! Yes. Yeah, and up till now, we've talked about everything Greek. We're going to switch out of Greek a little today. Before we do that, I want to mention why. Because even last week, we looked at other New Testament manuscripts. So remember, that technical word manuscript means handwritten Greek. That's just the way. So whenever you see someone who does textual criticism, if you say manuscript, they'll think Greek, handwritten. So even when it goes machine printed Greek, it's not a manuscript anymore. And that happens like in the 15th century. So anyway, so today we're going to get away from that because Greek is the original language the New Testament was written in. And so the Holy Grail, in a sense, I shouldn't use that word. What you really want to do is you'd like to reconstitute what the original handwritten Greek was, but we don't have any of the originals. So the purest, most rude attempt you can do to understand the Bible is find out what the Greek autographs were. So that's why there's so much study in Greek, because likely the autographs in Greek, what they wrote actually were copied into Greek and then into Greek and into Greek. So you're getting the actual words. That's what we're trying to do. Today we're going to get away from that and go to translation. So here's the other code word they use. When these guys talk about versions, they mean translations into other languages. I wish they just said translations. So manuscripts, Greek, handwritten, versions, translation. So these can be really powerful, and you'll see that today because the earliest translations were done in the 100s AD. So they go really far back. I mean, really far back. So but the downside, of course, on a translation is you do translation error. What word would you choose in your language to represent the Greek word? So there's a little bit of loss right there, but in general, if you stand back and you look at a translation into another language, the thoughts ought to match in the sentences, even if the words aren't exact matches. So see, there's a little bit of loss, but because these go back to the 100s in another language, you can get an idea for how they were reading Greek at the time and then translate it into their own language. So it's got great value because it reaches back pretty far. So these are translations from the Greek and from the Hebrew into more modern languages, which for us today are old languages. So there's three principally. The language of Syria is Syriac. Yeah, okay. Like the language of America is Amhariac. Not really. But there's Syriac, really important because the gospel went up into Syria relatively early. And then there's Coptic because it went down into Egypt. And the language of Egyptian in the first century was not hieroglyphics. It was actually Coptic. So by the time of the first century, Coptic, and interestingly enough, Coptic is written with Greek letters, but it's Egyptian words in Greek letters. Go figure. But anyway, the gospel went down to Egypt really quickly in the first century. And then lastly, and really importantly, Latin. Latin was being spoken in Italy at the time of the first century. So copies were made into these three languages. So that's what we're going to look at today, is these versions. So we start with Syria. The gospel goes up into Syria. This is really important. It's nearly identical to Aramaic. And if you remember, we talked about Aramaic as being an old language. It predated Hebrew in the Middle East. So Aramaic is like the base language of the Middle East, and Hebrew comes out of it. Other languages come out, Semitic languages come out of it. So it turns out that nearly everybody in the Middle East speaks Aramaic in the first century. If you happen to be part of the Greek Revolution that came through with Alexander the Greek, a lot of the more educated world in the Middle East spoke Greek as well. I mean, it was the lingua franca at the time. It was really a great language to spread the gospel. But a lot of people, if you weren't educated, still in the Middle East, you spoke Aramaic, and you had for a long time, like 1,000 years. So what's nice about Syriac is it's almost identical to Aramaic, which means if you translate this into Syriac, it doesn't only benefit people in Syria, it benefits people all the way, from the Mesopotamian Valley into what today is classically Arabic areas, because Arabic also comes from Aramaic. So it's really a nice language. It's a general purpose language. It helps people more all over the world than just in Syria. So that's a really big deal. So anyway, let me show you the things we're going to look at. We're going to look at the Diatessaron, some samples of the old Syriac, and then the Peshitta. I always twitch every time I say that. So So let's look at the diatessaron first. And diatessaron, that's a Greek constructed word, and diatessaron means through four. So dia, as in diameter, means to measure through, diameter, to measure through the circle, that's diameter. And so dia is through, and tessaron, tessa is four. So it's through four. So what it is through the four Gospels. So the diatessaron was a contraction of the four Gospels into one story. And we don't actually have a copy of it, but we have all this information that people had been studying out of it for a long time in the Syrian-speaking areas of the world. But we don't have a copy of it, but everyone refers to it. So if you have a harmony of the Gospels, which is a pretty big deal, at least it was for me when I was first a believer. In fact, there was this book called The Life of Christ in Stereo. And this fellow who was a Christian who was on his deathbed basically said, the last project I want to do is take the four Gospels, interweave the stories, and then put them together into one storyline, right? And that would be from chronological beginning to end. That would be the four Gospels all packed together. And after he finished that project, he died. So The Life of Christ in Stereo is a pretty cool book. That's what the diatessaron is. Someone took the four Gospels, and we know who it was, this guy Tatian, the four Gospels, and wove them together and made one book out of it. So that was in existence. It was the harmony of the four Gospels together. The author Tatian, we know he lived around 170 AD. So that means the diatessaron, which is the compaction of the four Gospels, existed and came out of four circulating Greek Gospels before 170 AD. So he had his hands on that and made this in Syriac. We have no surviving copy of it today. We just have references to it. For instance, this guy Ephraim, who was a preacher during the time in the 300s, he has huge commentaries on the diatessaron, and we have those, but we don't have the diatessaron. So he's actually commenting on we know on the diatessaron because he's mentioning gospel scenes that we're familiar with, but he puts them adjacent to each other when he's doing it in a way that would not normally be like just in Luke or just in John. I mean, they're kind of interwoven. So Ephraim, he's actually commenting on this interwoven gospel text in 170. Which means and we're in Mesopotamian area for Ephraim, so it really moved around. It was the standard text in Syrian churches from 180 until about the 400s. This four Gospels put together, and it would have kept going because it was very popular. Except in the 400s, something supplanted it, and we'll talk about that in a second. But here's these four interwoven Gospels for a couple hundred years. In the Aramaic, the Syriac-speaking world was the gold standard. But we don't have one. we don't have one, which is kind of crazy. So that's the diatessaron. Then there's the Old Syriac, and this is a style of Syriac that predates current Syriac. And there's two main manuscripts. Both of these really, really powerful. And here's what Old Syriac looks like. If you look at just the Curetonian Syriac, it's called the Curetonian Syriac because it was discovered by Dr. William Cureton. So the Syriac things he found are called Curetonian. You always got to give it a crazy. I think you should just call it the Syriac fragments of William Cureton, but that's just not cool enough. So anyway, he found these. They're in the British Museum today, and they were unknown until the middle of the 19th century. They were called the Evangelion de Mefresh. I can't even say that. Evangelion means a gospel. It's good news in Greek. But this was dated in the 400s or so. It's in an old style Syriac, and it was just the Gospels. So this was in circulation very early again too, in the 400s. So, and if you think about it, if you compare back to what we know about the Greek, remember we had handwritten Greek that started as early as about 125 fragments we have. And then when you move from the capital letter Greeks into the minuscules, into the lower capitals, that happens around 900 AD. So we have a lot of Greek that's much younger than this stuff is. But because the language is one's manuscripts, these are the versions. So the Curetonian Syriac, it's really very good in terms of its quality. And then the Sinaitic manuscript, which still uses that same old Syrian. See, it looks the same. This is one of those palimpsests where someone rewrites over the top of, so you save the vellum and you try and erase what's on it already, and you write something else on top of it. Well, the thing that was behind that is an old Syriac set of Gospels. And who found it? Well, at St. Catherine's Monastery, which we've already had cause to look at because Count Tischendorf went there and found Sinaiticus, the full Bible. Some ladies in the 19th century, they were actually pretty famous. We have a book about these two ladies, in fact, at home. But they decide, they're late in life, kind of spinsterish. They're sisters. They're twin sisters, as I believe, Agnes and Margaret Smith. And they come from a relatively wealthy family in England. As their hobby, they want to discover old Bible manuscripts. So they make their way to St. Catherine's, wondering if there's anything left at St. Catherine's. And they find this palimpsest. They find behind this, what's written in front, they find this old Syriac. Now, how these ladies could recognize old Syriac, I don't know. But they did. And they brought it to light. It's, like I said, it's a palimpsest set. It's just the Gospels. And it's that stuff, if the top picture, that's ghosted in the background right there. It's actually a very old style of Syriac. And they recognized that it was. It's written somewhere in the 300s to 400s. So that's pretty darn old. That's pretty darn old. And in Syriac. So we know that the Gospels have been translated into Aramaic style old Syriac. And here they are in St. Catherine's Monastery down in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula. So it's really kind of cool. Agnes and, do you remember Agnes and Margaret Smith? Yeah. Yeah, Margaret, right. So interesting ladies, very interesting ladies. They had a hard time, in fact, selling the fact that they found something important because a lot of people who were professional textual critics said, sure, you found something important at St. Catherine's. St. Catherine's is all dried up. There's nothing left out there. Tischendorf got everything that's worth getting, just stop it. Well, we think this is old Syriac. Well, yeah, sure you do. And then they became famous. So the sisters. And then let's move down to the Peshitta. So the Peshitta actually, that's the reason why the Diatessaron got displaced in the Syriac-speaking areas around 400. The Peshitta just means simple, and it's meant to embody the straightforward text of the Gospels. It's now in standard Syriac, so it's in a style and a language version of Syriac that's not like the Curetonian or the Sinaitic. It's a newer form, but when we say newer, I mean like 400 AD instead of 200 or 300. So it's a new form, and it's a form that kind of stuck in those speaking areas, and it became well known in the 400s. And so the church, especially in Syria in the 400s, saw the Diatessaron being used for everything, which is it's that smashed version of the four Gospels. And so they said, no, we have to stop using the Diatessaron because that's one man's merging of it. We need to use the pure, straight-up Gospels. That's the Peshitta. So the Peshitta came in, and they deliberately pushed the Diatesserons out of circulation in the Syrian churches and destroyed them, which is why we don't have them. We don't have any Diatessaron. But the Peshitta is really very, very good. It's like the backbone of Syriac Gospels. And we have 350 of them, and they're in excellent condition. So the Peshitta is a great touch point back to the 400s about what the Gospels said that got translated into Syriac. So if you destroyed every Greek manuscript we had today, you could go back to the Peshitta and reconstruct it. It's just a great parallel, saving. And when it got distributed, like I said, because the language is so much like standard Aramaic, the Peshitta got copied and just went everywhere. It was, through the Middle East, it was like everywhere. It was the Bible in the Middle East for a long, long time. So pretty darn cool. Okay, let's get off of Syriac. Let's go to the Coptic. Coptic's interesting. The language that grew up in Egypt. So as the gospel went down there, there's two dialects of Coptic. This one, the Sahidic dialect, is in the south, but it's called the Upper Coptic. Because when you go south in Egypt, you go higher in elevation, so Upper Coptic is in the south. You don't need to know that. Okay, but it's earlier. There's two basic ones. Back in the 200s, this stuff is, this is Egyptian street language in the 200s to 300s. It's in print today. I looked it up. I can buy this book, Sahidica, the New Testament according to the Sahidic Coptic text. Whoa! That's cool, because we have a lot of really good copies of the Sahidic dialect of the Coptic translation. And then another one, the Boharic, which is the northern dialect, which is Lower Egypt, because that's the Delta, Alexandria, okay. So it's a little bit later by about 100 years, but you can also get that too. Here's the Coptic version of the New Testament in the northern dialect, otherwise called the Memphitic and Boharic. So So you can get this today. They're transliterated and they're right there. So if you read Bohairic Coptic, you could get this yourself. But it's pretty much the identical text that you read in Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, which is in Greek. So when you just reverse translate the Coptic words into Greek, you get Sinaiticus. So it's pretty interesting. So anyway, so that's the Coptic. And then lastly, we'll spend most of our time on Latin, because this is the foundation of English Bibles. I don't know if you knew that. So there's actually an old version of Latin, circa 160 or so. It's very informal. It makes sense because Paul wrote the letter to the Romans. He sent it to Rome. They spoke Latin there. That was the state language there. Intellectuals used Greek if you were a philosopher. So that was very well known too. But you had Latin. So when Paul writes in the 50s to Rome, 50s to 60s, somewhere in there, it's very likely that someone said, this is so valuable, we need to turn it into street language Rome. So they turned it into Latin. It would be Old Latin, a form of Old Latin. So that's what we're talking about right here. Here's an interesting historical data point. If you happen to be part of the Catholic Church or the Greek Orthodox Church, you know about these guys, but we don't study church history. But there's an interesting history data point in this. It's called the Silesian Martyrs. Silesians in North Africa. It's a dozen people who basically were arrested in 180 AD. They were arrested by the authorities because at that time Christianity was illegal, right? From about 60 AD for another 250 years to 310, it's illegal. So if you get arrested for being a Christian, you will be killed. Well, these 12, the Silesian martyrs, got arrested, just being Christians, got arrested, and were put on trial, and we have the trial manuscript from 180 AD. And in the trial manuscript, there's a cool thing. There's 12 of them. Yeah, I got this off the internet on Wikipedia. You can go look at it yourself. I mean, and it says right here on the right, venerated in the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. But this is a real piece of history, 180 AD. Here's what's interesting. So I took this text out. Spiritus is a guy who ended up being the spokesman in the trial for the 12 martyrs. And so this is what Spiritus said. This is from the trial in July 180 AD. And here's what he says. When called upon, this is Wikipedia summarizing it a bit. When called upon to swear by the name of the emperor, he replied, I recognize not the empire of this world, but rather do I serve that God whom no man hath seen, nor with eyes can see. And if you know the New Testament, that's 1 Timothy. He's quoting 1 Timothy in the trial record. 1 Timothy 6:16. In reply to the question, what are the things in your satchel? He said, books and letters of Paul, a just man. So, in this trial of 180 AD, this guy's carrying around a bag, the letters of Paul. Is that cool or what? I mean, it's really, and of course they're in Old Latin because in 180 AD. So by the time you get to 180 AD, you have Old Latin transcriptions, versions of the Greek Gospels and Paul's letters. Now he doesn't mention anything about the Gospels, but he does mention Paul's letters, which were the earliest documents in the New Testament, written in 50s, 60s, something like that, and some sent right to Rome. So it makes sense that he would have in his bag books of Paul. Isn't that cool? That is in the transcript of that thing. Anyway, let me push on from there because that's just an interesting tidbit. What's a bigger deal is the Latin Vulgate, and you've heard the Latin Vulgate term before. It's like the backbone of Western Bible understanding. Written by this guy Jerome in 384 AD. So he comes about 50 to 60 years after the Council of Nicaea. He's born, and he translates the four Gospels. Let me see what I've got on here. Oh yeah, there he is. If you go to Israel and you go to Bethlehem, you'll see the statue. I don't know do you remember the statue, Karen? It's when you go to Bethlehem and you go to the Church of the Nativity, and actually when you go to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, there's actually two churches there. There's a church of, I think it's St. Catherine's, and then the church, they're right next to each other, so you don't know when you're walking into one or the other. This is outside St. Catherine's, but it says at the bottom down here, S. Hieronymus, that S is his middle name, I forget what it is, but his common name in Greek, the Greekized version of his name, is Eusebius Hieronymus. But that's too much, so we call him Jerome. So Jerome he was an interesting guy. He was an intellectual during that time. He was a semi-Christian for a while, and then in a dream, God said, "What are you?" And in the dream, he said, "I'm a Christian." And God said, "No, you're not a Christian." That really freaked him out in the dream. He went off, became kind of an ascetic, and started reading ancient Bible. He was big into ancient pagan documents because he could read them because of his background. He started reading ancient Bible and became a Christian. And then dedicated his life, did some very ascetic stuff like monks out in the desert for a while, until he got a call from this guy. There he is, the ascetic. By the way, there's always a picture of a skull. And you see there's a skull down there too? Yeah. Read the life of Jerome and you'll see why. It's part of the ascetic background that he had. But that's artistic. Anyway, this guy, Bishop Damasus, in 382, realizes that the Gospels are circulating in the common language of the Old Latin, and they've been copied so many times, there's some disputes about what's there. So Damasus says, we need to take these Gospels that are in Old Latin, put them first into New Latin, in the current Latin, and we need someone to tell us what's right and wrong in the circulating Gospels where there's slight changes. So he calls up Jerome and says, will you come back home? At this time, he's out in the middle of the desert, I think. Come back home, and will you kind of get this all together? We want to publish a New Testament. We'll start with the 4 Gospels, and you need to sort out all the old Latin translations that are in circulation. And since you know Greek, you can check them against the Greek copies and make a really solid Latin Gospels. So he comes back to Rome. That's what he does. And then in 384, he finishes the 4 Gospels, and he knows that this is going to be a political nightmare, because people who are used to one reading or another reading in the circulating Old Latins will get really ticked off if he presents a different reading for the verses. You know what I mean? You sort of do that today with King James and stuff. So anyway, he does the translation, and he knows it's going to be, it could be really dangerous. I mean, he might have to actually fear for his life. So Damasus says, I know it's a controversial thing to do, but we just got to get our act together, and you will offend the people who cling to one Old Latin version and it's slightly different. So do it anyway. He finishes the 4 Gospels and almost immediately has to leave town. It's that controversial. So he goes to Bethlehem the next year, which is why he's here shown in Bethlehem, because when he goes to Bethlehem, he decides to try and find out more about the Bible. So let's go to Bethlehem. And in Bethlehem, there were caves. So he found a cave in Bethlehem to live in that was cool in the summertime. And that cave set is actually underneath the St. Catherine's Monastery that's at Bethlehem next to the Church of the Nativity. Most people don't go down and see that. You'll go downstairs on the Church of the Nativity and see that underground kind of alcove. There's stuff down there. And the little, looks like fireplace, Jesus place and stuff like that. But in a different part of the complex, which people have never taken to, underneath the larger church, there's a whole bunch of caves, and they've proved this is where Jerome did his translations. It's like right there. That's why his statue is right outside that building. It takes him 20 years then to complete the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And it is the language foundation for the Gutenberg Bible. Because when Gutenberg typesets the Bible for the first time, he typesets the Latin Vulgate that Jerome did. So a Gutenberg Bible is Latin. It's in Latin. But it's the result of what Jerome had done. Now look at the time span between these. So the Latin Vulgate that Jerome did was in circulation for 1,000 years. It was the backbone of Western understanding of the Bible for 1,000 years. Then it gets typeset, and it continues to go on until it goes in other languages. But it's in Latin. It's not in English. It's in Latin, the Gutenberg Bible. So let's look more at this, because this is super important. When you get about 100 years after that, the Catholic Church decides to officially, what do you want to call that, authorize the Latin Vulgate as being the church of the Catholic Church, or the book of the Catholic Church, the Bible. So a Council of Trent, which a lot of, if you're a historian, look at the Council of Trent, Catholic Church. A lot of things get decided and put, stamped, and this is the way it's going to be. But that's when they put their official stamp on the Vulgate. So in 1546, and Vulgata just means common, which is why vulgar talk is common talk. And it's common not because it's street language, but because it's the normal modern language. It's the common language, and common always means accepted as two. So Vulgata sort of means both the standard modern language as well as the generally accepted Bible. So Vulgata means the generally accepted Bible. It's a really big deal for the West, really big deal. We find there's over 10,000 manuscripts of it. I shouldn't use the word manuscript. That means Greek. I should have taken that out. But there's 10,000 copies of it. It is, without question, it's the most copied Christian book of all history, is the Latin Vulgate. It's a really big deal. You just can't underestimate it. It's a revision of the Old Latin with Greek checks, like I said. So he took the Old Latins that were in circulation, checked them against the Greek, and then came up with the Vulgate. 1,000 years, that's the Bible of Western Europe for 1,000 years, which is why also when you see the Catholic Church history during those 1,000 years, and you see what goes on Sunday morning in Mass in the Catholic Church, it's always in Latin because they're reading out of the Latin Vulgate. I mean, forever. from about 400 or so AD up through the Council of Trent in the 1500s, all the way up into the 1960s, they're still reading out loud the Latin Vulgate that was penned by Jerome in the 400s. So it's a big deal in the West. It's the Gutenberg Bible. Like I said, the Latin Vulgate is in the Gutenberg Bible. And there's Latin words that get invented in the Latin to represent the Greek. Like these are all Latin words that were stuck in there, which you probably recognize. But those are all Latin words, Latin roots. So, yeah. A guy, Langton, he was a copyist. He decided to put in chapter divisions into the Bible. So he came up with the chapter divisions. He's the guy that I have to blame when we're reading through sections of the Bible and the chapter heading comes at a really inopportune time. Langton, bad. Langton, nasty. And in fact, he just put in chapters. He didn't put in the verses. The verse numbers, those are put in by another printer. I think it's after you get to movable type, so it's post-Gutenberg. And this guy's in France. I forget his name because I spit on him sometimes too, where he splits the verses. But he was in such a rush to get his version of the Bible printed, and he wanted to put in the numbering of the verses. He did it actually in transit from where he lived to where the printer was. So he's in a carriage basically kind of going, okay, that's 11. Okay, that's 12. And so, yeah, he's an interesting guy too. So this is the Roman Catholic Bible, and interestingly enough, when you get the Roman Catholic English Bible, it's translated from the Latin Vulgate, because of course the Vulgate is just a big deal with the Catholic Church. So that's one interesting distinction. If you pick up a Catholic Bible and it reads slightly differently, it's because the Catholic English comes from the Latin Vulgate, and we try and take our English and get it as far back to predate Latin to get to the Greek. So that's a wholly different, process in that sense. That's why there's difference. So it's really a translation from a translation. And right there is a Gutenberg Bible. It's the University of Texas. And it's the Latin Vulgate, which dominates the understanding of the Gospels all the way from 400 until 1960s, when modern translations start to hold more sway, especially in the Catholic community. So big deal. But interestingly enough, you look at a Latin Bible like the Vulgate, which is here in the Gutenberg Bible, and you say, well, this is the 15th century. This doesn't tell us anything about the real words in the Bible, does it? Well, it does, because Jerome wrote them down back in the 300s and 400s. So he's looking at things circulating in Latin, and then in the Gospels, he's checking against the Greek that he has on hand in the late 300s. So that's pretty darn cool. So it does give us a relatively errorless path back to the 3rd and 4th century of a translation into Latin. So it's not Greek, but it is a translation into Latin by a guy who's very scholarly. So it gives you sort of a parallel path like the Coptic and like the Syriac. It gives you a parallel path that goes all the way back to the 300s and 400s to check your Greek, which also comes from the 200s, 300s, 400s, as well as the Coptic that comes from the 200s in the Sahidic. So there's a lot of parallel translation paths that go way back, and you can check the meaning of what's going on in the verses. And these are just great tests for that. Okay, I think that's all I got. Yeah. So questions on that? Yeah, Steve.